and other secondary literature, and trying to come up with what they thought the temple looked like. And we're beginning to get something approaching what modern scholars think the temple was like. Temple symbolism pops up all over the place with these columns. These are known as Solomonic columns, because when Constantine built the first Vatican in the 4th century, he is said to have brought, I think it's 24 columns from Solomon's temple and used them to build the Vatican. He rebuilt Solomon's temple using these columns. And these columns are these twisty ones like this, these curly ones. And so they become Solomonic columns. They appear in art and architecture all over the place. This is the Baldacchino of Bernini in St. Peter's today, a splendid thing, but it then becomes the Holy of Holies, using these pillars to recreate Solomon's temple in a sense. All sorts of mystics use temple motifs in many different ways. Sir Isaac Newton wrote a whole book about ancient chronology and so forth, and tries to recreate what the temple looked like in many different plans. Magicians were using all sorts of Solomonic motifs. This is the seal of Solomon, used by magicians in all sorts of different ways. But they also did what they called a magic circle. This magic circle was designed to protect them from demonic powers and so forth, or perhaps to imprison demons within it. But notice the use of all these names of the Lord, Adonai, Tetragrammaton, and so forth. The magicians, by using the name of the Lord, are essentially usurping the role of the high priest, right? When they do this, and that's what they're doing in their circles. Here's a description of how you make a magic circle in a magic book by a guy named Pseudo-Agrippa, and Pseudo is not his real name, but fourth book of occult philosophy. And he says, when you would consecrate a place or a magic circle, you ought to take the prayer Solomon used in the dedication of the temple. In other words, if you make a magic circle, you got to say Solomon's prayer, because you're creating a temple by making this, or a sacred space by making this. Freemasons, of course, have all sorts of temple motifs. Here's a famous one with the compass of Christ creating the universe using the compass tool. Here's a very interesting one. This is 13th century pre-Freemason, but here you've got Solomon and you've got Hiram of Tyre, and notice he's got a square there, and behind him you can see the cherubs on the Ark of the Covenant. But this is a typological motif paralleling Christ, Peter, and Paul, and the church. So Solomon's temple, the church, Peter and Paul, fulfilling these roles of the builders of the new temple, the new church, and so forth. But using what will become a Masonic symbolism with the square there. Here's a picture of used by French Masons, equating all their Masonic stuff with temple, all the different temple things here, the showbread table, altar of incense, menorah, and so forth. They're all associated with Freemasonry in that way. There's also interesting movements called Neo-Templar movements, which developed in the 18th century, and they essentially create a new Templar mythology, associating them with all sorts of mystical things. You've picked this up in the Da Vinci Code, if you've read that. The Templars pop up as a element in there, and temple motifs go on. And his new book's going to be the Solomon Key, I think, is what it's entitled. So who knows what Solomonic stuff might be in there. Modern scholars from the 19th century on through archaeology have attempted to recreate what the temple looked like. This is a guy named Tissot trying to tell us what Herod's temple looked like. Here is Tissot's depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. And of course this gets picked up in Indiana Jones. The basis of this, the one they used in the movie, was based on Tissot's painting here. Archaeology has uncovered all sorts of stuff. There's a huge archaeological movement and scholarly movement designed just to try to figure out what the temple was, what it looked like, and how and what it means. It's a whole independent branch of ancient studies. Here we're running out of time. So there's also a political dimension with the Arab-Israeli crisis, the struggle over who's going to control this Temple Mount, and what we're going to do with it. When the Israelis made their seal, they took it from the temple vision of Zechariah in Zechariah 4, with the menorah and the olive branches recounted in that. Go read Zechariah 4, look at that seal, you'll see that's what they're doing there. The Israelis captured the Temple Mount in 67, and this fellow Rabbi Goren this fellow here, and his cohorts tried to blow it up. They were prevented by other Israelis, but here you can see the Israeli soldiers taking over this, and it spawns a whole phenomenon in Israel called the Third Temple movements, in which they are attempting to destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild Solomon's temple in its third form. And this is the Temple Mount Faithfuls movement, and it says here, you know, the third temple. They're ready to build the third temple, and these are cornerstones for that temple that they've cut and they annually try to go up on the Temple Mount and set those down. The Israeli police always prevent them from doing it because they don't want to start riots and stuff. But there's this strong movement in Israel, and there's an equally strong movement among evangelicals. Now, there's all sorts of ways evangelicals interpret the temple, but if you read Left Behind books, the Antichrist builds the temple, right? That's one of the things that happens. I haven't read them, but I hope he does, because that's what we said in the book. It said it on the blurb, right? So I assume that it really happened in the book. Randall Price is an evangelical who's written numerous books on this subject. If you want the evangelical perspective, he's probably the guy to turn to. So what we end up with then, as after 3,000 years, the temple has influenced art, architecture, all sorts of different ways, theology, and it still continues to be probably the most intractable problem for the Arab-Israeli conflict. Is it going to be a place that we fight over and kill over, or is it a house of prayer for all nations, which Isaiah prophesied that it would become? And so, you know, if you look at Solomon's temple as this overarching cultural phenomenon, it's everywhere in Judaism and Christianity and Islam. It's really quite amazing. From the fair perspective, there's a couple things you can take a look at. Lots of evangelicals say Christians never built temples or cared about temples. It's everywhere in Christianity. There's also all sorts of ascent mysticism associated with the temple. That is with a celestial temple in heaven. The real one on earth is destroyed, but you ascend into heaven and visit the celestial temple, and that's how you enter into the presence of God, by entering into this celestial temple. I guess it's time for questions. Sorry we took so long.